Hi there, Victor Pross speaking to you, anarchist artist. Okay, there we go. It's been a little while since I've done a video, but today we're going to talk about Hobbes and the conception of the state of nature, Objectivism and anarchism. And it's going to be a very interesting talk, I can assure you. You will benefit a lot. It will provide considerable insight in today's issues when it comes to politics and the state and anarchy and all the conceptions or misconceptions that people have revolving around these very broad abstractions, of course. And this is what if it helps you clarify your own thinking or makes you a better communicator in the communication of these ideas, all the better. So it's for those two sets of audience, people who are curious about anarchism and might have questions about the state, or if you're a libertarian or just a very thoughtful philosophical person, this podcast is for you pertaining to the subject that we're going to cover today. Okay, now I'm sure that you're quite experienced with the phenomena of speculations into human nature whenever you venture to mention anything about anarchism. Might be an idea that forms in your own head. Yeah, well, sounds very utopian to me. I mean, what about human nature? You're in your little la unicorn land, blah, 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 blah. We hear this bullshit all the time. I've been hearing it for the last 30 years, of course. And so that's part of the issue of what we're going to tackle today. The speculations into human nature, of course, there is, I am reminded of a certain meme that I've seen on Facebook now and then. It goes something like this. It's the lettering, the typography goes around a circle, and it says, people are bad, so we need a government of people are bad. And it goes around and around again and again. Of course, it's like a run-on sentence. And people are bad, so we need a government of people are bad. So we need a government of people are bad. And goes round and round and round. And I think that communicates a very important point and is very instrumental to the points that I would like to make today. There are, of course, many people who mock the idea of a stateless society as impractical, as it would inevitably lead to the breakdown of civil society. And a stateless society without a government, a centralized authority running that society, strikes people as absolutely ludicrous. The very idea of a society without government, does bring up a whole tundra of horrific images. Like the you get from people that you communicate these ideas. It's the first thing that pops into their head. Speculations about human nature, even if it's an implicit thought in the back of their head, right? So you do get that kind of deer in the headlights look. The as if you were making the case that one should leave their young children alone at night without any babysitter while you go out on a night of town, right? It's as if you're purporting that the running of an insane asylum should be left to the patients and not the doctors and the administrative staff. So that's basically what people hear when you start speaking of a stateless society. And that is the image of anarchy, that without a centralized authority and accompanied by law, and a lot of people, centralized authority is immediately followed up with the thought of law as if it was one and the same thing, of course, right? Life would be like every Sex Pistols song you heard, every Purge Anarchy movie you saw, every episode of the Sons of Anarchy you consumed. That's what anarchy is, you see, without a centralized authority. And in other words, life would be in a state of nature. A state of nature. Now that leads you to a clue. I specifically named this video Hobbes, The State of Nature, Objectivism, and Anarchism. And that brings us to the crux, to the nebulous of what we're going to cover today. This is no accident that people view things this way. It's no accident. This is not a natural conclusion that people come to in regards to human nature, in regards to anarchism, and in regards to the function and the role of the state. All these thoughts have been handed down from the ivory towers, and we the people have sucked it up as if it was a metaphysical given. You know, death and taxes, death, a metaphysical fact that nobody can do anything about, and taxes as if both were metaphysical states. This is no accident, no accident. Now the question comes from, where does this come from, these ideas? Well, it comes from the philosophers. Comes from the philosophers, my friends. And why should you listen to me in regards to this? Like, who am I to purport all of this so far? Hey, look I'm somebody who's simply studied philosophy for the last 30 years. That's all. That's who I am. Does that not account for anything? I took Professor John Redpath's course, Intellectual History and Economics. I've learned a lot, and I've had numerous conversations with him and in private. He's an objectivist professor. So in terms of his course, Intellectual History, 30 years of study, I think I've gathered some information to communicate that's worthwhile. So just to provide some credentials or credibility or street cred, just to let you know that. Now, I say these ideas come from the philosophers. The principal philosophers that come to mind, but not certainly limited to these two, would be Hobbes and Locke. Thomas Hobbes and Jonathan Locke. And I do think that the fundamental debate of the modern era is a continuing clash between the ideas of these two political philosophers, Hobbes and Locke. Let's see if I got any questions so far. Oh, we got Brandon Cropper, of course, right? Yeah, he's right on it. I hope you continue to listen, and hopefully you'll learn something, but we'll see. So anyway, the state of nature is a concept that is used in moral and political philosophy to denote the hypothetical conditions of what the lives of people might have been like before societies came into existence, you see. See, it was a state of nature. It was pre-societal. So that's the idea. Now, all philosophers of the state of nature theory deduce that there must have been a time before organized societies existed, and this presumption thus raises questions such as, what was life like before civil society? How did governments first emerge in such a strain from a starting position such as that? Now, for the purpose of the thesis of this podcast, I will focus on the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. And even there, however, briefly though, and anything that I have to say about the state of nature or Thomas Hobbes or other philosophers' views on the state of nature, that would be a whole series of podcasts in itself. So for the interest of limitations and brevity here, let me just deal with some aspects of Hobbes' approach to the state of nature and so forth. Now, for Hobbes, human beings are inherently vicious, and left to their own devices, will live without society in a war against all, to quote Hobbes there, in a war of all against all. Now, as Hobbes' most famous phrase puts it, I'm sure you're familiar with it, man's life in a state of nature will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But, hold on, my friends. Hold on, my friends. Here comes the super state. Oh, here comes Jesus Christ himself. to deliver the sinful mankind from the ultimate state of hell on earth, and removing it from underground, of course, to the from the supernatural to up here on the earth, where the Jesus Christ superstar super state is going to save humanity, brothers. See, that's the idea here. That's the ideas that are being communicated here. Now, fortunately, the state does relieve mankind from this very unpleasant condition, a state of nature, by curbing and taming humanity's evil inclinations and enforcing society and cooperation. Now, Thomas Hobbes, as we see, holds a negative conception of the state of nature, unlike Jonathan Locke, where life wasn't necessarily nasty and brutish and short. In fact, it wasn't that at all, but it wasn't an optimal society that a government can bring. So, that's differences between Hobbes' approach to that of Locke's approach to the state of nature. So, but in Hobbes' view, though, a state of nature does represent a state of permanent war, a permanent threat to the continued existence of the individual. Now, we can see that that's a view that a lot of people have adopted. You talk to anybody about anarchism, that's what comes to mind. Where does this come from? Where does it come from? It comes from the philosophy departments, handed down by the philosophers, all types of philosophers. Not that all of this is to be put on to Thomas Hobbes, of course. There's a multitude of other philosophers have contributed to statism. You have that with Plato, of course. He's the big daddy collectivist, one of the first in Plato's Republic. But I do diverge from my my thesis here. Now, according to Hobbes, without laws, it is the law of the jungle, and government and laws being lumped together like in a package deal, like there's never been, like they cannot be separated. I'll get to that in later podcasts about the history of law and how it's been preempted by the states, just like ethics is being preempted by religion. So, but we'll get to that. But the assumption right now is that government and the state and law necessarily go together, like the elbow goes together with the arm. You don't speak of one without the other, right? There are consequences connected to this state of nature, the absence of any concept of law, justice, and property. All this comes to mind as well. Without the state, you do not have law, you do not have justice, you don't have property. So according to Hobbes, but where there is no law, there is no justice, and no common power of authority is in place to administer justice, you see. So that's the idea. So if you don't have the administration of justice, you don't have, the conception of property rights, and you don't have production, because it's a completely chaotic, anarchistic state, you see, right? Anarchy and chaos are considered to be synonymous, though, but they aren't. They are very different conceptions. But this is the bullshit that we've all been led to believe, naturally, of course. This is what I've learned by taking Professor Redpath, objectivist Professor John Redpath's course, Intellectual History. Now, in short, the state of nature is war, which can be stopped only by law. And that's the premise that Hobbes makes to explain the transition from a state of nature to the civilized state. From a state of nature to the civilized state. And you also have, my friends, Ayn Rand chirping in on anarchism, just like a whole host of other philosophers, political philosophers have barreled down on anarchism, as there's been philosophers who do make a case for it, right? So, it had throughout the centuries, it's been a philosophical clash, of course, right? But, Hobbes' original views are just further entrenched by Rand. And let me quote Ayn Rand on anarchism, and I quote Ayn Rand on her contributions to the thought of what anarchy is all about. Okay, quote, "Anarchy, as a political concept, is a naive, floating abstraction. A society without an organized government would be at the mercy of the first criminal who came along and who precipitated into the chaos of gang warfare. But the possibility of human immorality is not the only objection to anarchy. Even a society whose every member were fully rational and faultlessly moral could not function in a state of anarchy. It is the need of objective law and an arbiter for honest disagreements among men that necessitates the establishment of government. If a society provided no organized protection against force, it would compel every citizen to go about armed, to turn his home into a fortress, to shoot any strangers approaching his door, or to join a protective gang of citizens who would fight for other gangs formed for the same purpose, and thus bring about the degeneration of that society into the chaos of gang rule by brute force, into a perpetual tribal warfare of prehistorical savages. Unquote. You can see how Rand is deeply bought into the whole Hobbesian premise here. Prehistorical. It's even prehistorical savages. It's pre-societal. If it's prehistorical, right? It's even pre-societal. And that's what we, even in the midst of an industrial civilization with the Age of Enlightenment, we would just, without a centralized authority, we'd completely just retrograde and collapse back to that again, right? As if, as if the government is not already bringing us there, right? Oh, Jesus Christ. It's unreal, man. It's unreal how people cannot see through all this. And you even have objectivist scholar Leonard Peikoff, who is the intellectual heir to Ayn Rand, and he writes, and this is the kicker. This is the real kicker. When I read this and actually learned the history of anarchism, it really pissed me off. I felt like I was duped by Peikoff. And here, listen to this quote: "Anarchism is the idea that there should be no government. In objectivist terms, this amounts to the view that every man should defend himself by using physical force against others whenever he feels like it, with no objective standards of justice, crime, or proof." Like, holy fuck, man. Like, this is not what anarchism means. No anarchist I know defends using physical force whenever he feels like it as a serious idea to consider. Like, all of the writers, all of the thinkers who've examined and probed and uprooted the ideas of the state, and who've made the case for the possibility of law without a centralized authority, and have questioned jurisprudence and justice, and who have pondered all of these philosophical questions, all types of anarchist thinkers, to just to completely Peikoff, a philosophy professor, just to completely discount all of that. I don't say he has to agree with it, but just to pretend it doesn't exist, that body of work, and just to purport that every anarchist is going about, so I just want to use force whenever I feel like it, as if that's all there is. I mean, there's fuckwads in the movement, so subjectivists, fuckwad idiots, of course, going around like that. But they're writing on a pop culture caricature version of anarchism. They're not seriously studied in these matters. They go around talking like that, and it's not the predominant way that people go about it. Like even Brandon Cropper had a discussion with Matt Sands on this issue. He's explaining what law is not necessarily absent from the scenario here. But anyway, I don't want to get off too much of a digress. Let's get just back to the meat of the podcast here. So, scary anarchism, created by certain political philosophers. So that we can see that objectivists unwittingly share the same philosophical premises with Thomas Hobbes. According to Thomas Hobbes, Man is not by nature a social animal, and that society could not exist except by the power of the state, which is made up of people. People are bad, so we need a government of people. You see how fucking ludicrous all of this is? Jeez. So man is essentially in a state of nature, and as such, he is a mechanistic brute until the superstate comes along, the Calvary. For the most part, anarchy has functioned as the political equivalent of hell. Just to take dethrone God from the throne with the Age of Enlightenment. Then all of a sudden, when the statism took on a rise, we replaced God on the throne with the state now. Sometimes when you're listening to objectivists, even you get the same kind of fucking tenor in their tones when they talk about the government, like it's like this kind of savior, and. Oh, I don't know about the people. The people. Well, the government is made up of people. This is so fucking elementary, man. It's just so fucking elementary. So this is where the modern conceptions of anarchy that we see all around us, this is where it comes from in part. It comes from popular culture. It all comes from Hobbes. It comes from Plato. It's perpetrated by Rand now. So the question, I guess, would be, who is the final authority when it comes to conflict resolution in an anarchist society? Well, I'm just going to offer some preamble thoughts in regards to that, but we will get deeper into that, to that question. Who is to provide conflict resolution in an anarchist society? Because we do realize, of course, that there would be contractual disagreements. There will be violent people. All of this has to be contended with, and all of it has been in tons and scores of anarchist literature, or even in a libertarian literature as well, or even by the classical liberals as well. So in an anarchist society, the challenge is put forth: who, I ask you, who would administer proper justice? My inclination is always to say that whenever I get this shit from people, who's going to administer justice? Who's going to build the roads? My answer has always been, people. Like, what the fuck is that? What's the nature of this question? Where's that coming from? It just sounds so fucking retarded. Like it's who. It's the owl syndrome when it comes to talking about anarchism. There's a Rand had an article, who is the final authority in ethics, and I think that her article probably is probably a good point of reference to illustrate a point that I want to make. Now, in that article, she basically writes, there are certain questions that must be questioned, that is challenged at their root, because they consist of smuggling a false premise into the mind of a careless listener. Who created the universe is one such question. Do you still beat your wife is another. And so is the above question: who is to provide conflict resolution in a stateless anarchist, totally consistently free, liberty-driven society? Who? See, here we go back, we revert to that even the objectivists find troubling is who will build the roads, right? And I'm sure an objectivist would answer, well, people would build the fucking roads, right? Because even in a limited government minarchist objectivist model, I guess the roads are not being left to the government, right? Because the government is only supposed to serve three fundamental primary services. And that would be the police, the law courts, and the military. So I guess the roads don't come in there, right? So, so for an objectivist to have to bear that, my sympathies, right? Who will build the roads, right? Well, the same frustration I have as an anarchist comes when it comes to matters of justice, right? So it comes up in many different ways. Rand argues directly and indirectly. It's like who this, who that, who's the final authority in ethics. This is the question that's been put to Rand. She's dealing with it. It's usually asked in some formulation such as who decides what is wrong, right or wrong? This is, of course, like classic subjectivism, which plagues us in modern times, of course, and who. So it's just all subjectivism. Yeah, it's just all subjective goo. Who decides what is right or wrong, right? And I would argue that the who is to provide conflict resolutions and administer proper justice in a stateless society also follows along that lines of thinking, of that false thinking. See, that's what I'm trying to get across to you here. Okay, now it is obvious that Rand continues in this article, who is the final authority in ethics. It is obvious that the root of such questions is a certain kind of conceptual vacuum, the absence of the concept of objectivity. Precisely. Now she writes, objectivity is both a metaphysical and epistemological concept that pertains to the relationship of consciousness to existence. The relationship between human volitional consciousness to that of existence. In other words, grasping existence, making causal connections and relationships and so forth. Metaphysically, it is the recognition of the fact that reality exists independent of any perceiver's consciousness. I'm elaborating on this for a reason. I haven't left, the thesis of my podcast here. I ask you to bear with me and to listen to this. All will be wrapped up as why I'm getting into some of the meat of this article. So Rand continues that this means that although reality is immutable, okay, then in any given context, only one answer is true. The truth is not automatically available to human consciousness and can be obtained only by certain mental processes, which is required of every man who seeks knowledge. That there is no substitute for this process, no escape from the responsibility for it, no shortcuts, no special revelations to privileged observers, and that there can be no such thing as a final authority in matters pertaining to human knowledge. Now listen to that last line. There can be no such thing as a final authority in matters pertaining to human knowledge. Now you see how that conflicts with the whole idea of government? How they are allotted opposing moral principles, that they are put into a centralized, monopolized position. So she writes, she continues, and to bury her own idea of government in this article, by the way, incidentally, metaphysically, the only authority is reality. Epistemologically, one's own mind. The first is the ultimate arbiter of the second. It is the individual who has the sole responsibility of grasping the objective reality that's around him. So when you ask who decides what is right or wrong, the individual based on the facts of reality. Nobody decides how to build a bridge to ensure its durability and standing, that its function to the purpose of why it's being created. You just don't go about it willy-nilly, and what you base on what you feel is what will hold it together. A bunch of lollipop sticks put together by Elmer's glue, because you feel like that's the best way to go about it. No, there's a reality. There's physics involved here. There's engineering. There's mathematics, for Christ's sakes. And who decides all of that? Each individual has the responsibility of grasping those laws, those engineering laws. That's who. Everything that we've created in this society, this industrial civilization, came from thinking individuals. They can transmit that knowledge, but the knowledge transmitted has to be grasped by the person who's taking it in, to accept it, to understand it, to grasp it, to reject it, or whatever the case may be. right? And that just not applies to here. Like I said, we live in an industrial civilization, right? So we've risen from the caves to understand mathematics, philosophy, laws, ethics, how to build a bridge, architecture, computers, toothpaste. And you mean to tell me that concepts such as justice and law can only be grasped by a small handful of people, or to hold ultimate, monopolized, centralized power at the expense of the citizenry? And we put people into these two opposing categories, the ruling elite and the citizenry. Sometimes they become one and the other. If one gets elected to office, so he goes into that magic world of opposing moral principles. Now, he's got all this power, like Trump, for example. He was a citizen. He was a reality show host, a businessman, and wow, now he's got all this power at his hands, that nobody else has, right? So we can grasp and apply proper definitions of justice, and that is what the anarchists would argue for, that we can grasp this, we can apply this, that society can organize in such a way as to ensure this. If it is a modern, industrialized, still hanging by the fading remnants of an Enlightenment philosophy, of course, but that's another story. And you also get this subjectivism, this implicit subjectivism from other philosophical thinkers, such as Beninato. And I'll cover that. What else do we have here? We got quite a few people here. Let's see here. I am not new, Victor. I got kicked off Facebook and Twitter a long time ago, waiting for your post on this channel. I am also an anarchist. Well, hello, brother. Nice to see you. Yeah, it's been a little while. I'm going to be doing some more podcasts regularly, if that's good news. I know it's good news for Cropper. Mr. Cropper there. But let's get back to what I was talking about here. I want you to listen to this. I want you to listen to Robert Beninato. He's an objectivist, and he wrote in The Contradiction of Anarchism. He writes, exactly who determines what the use of what use of force is initiatory and coercive, and what is defensive or retaliatory? Who decides that? By what process is that determination made? Or, to put it in terms of rights, who determines whether, in any given use of force, rights have been violated, and thus, who is the aggressor and who is the victim? Who decides that? By what procedure? What theory or of interpretation of rights is to be used? Rand's, Henry George's, Lenin's, Mr. Anarchist? Who is going to decide that? Woo! For society, how are such determinations made with finality? And how is that verdict enforced? And as a corollary, who determines which agency is a protection agency and which is a mere gang of aggressors? By what method and standard? You see, anarchists sincerely believe that they are merely advocating competition in the protection of rights. In fact, what their position would necessitate is competition in defining what rights are. Oh, man. Now, do you see, brothers and sisters, listening to this podcast, you see how the objectivists are riding implicitly, just by philosophical default, intellectual error, riding on the premises of Thomas Hobbes. Reject it. It's false. Fuck Thomas Hobbes. And fuck these bullshit objectivist views on anarchism. Don't get me wrong. Said it many times before. I'll say it again. I am with Rand. I've been greatly influenced by her. I have all the homage and respect I can bestow upon the woman. I've consumed all of her works, fiction and nonfiction. I'm with Rand when it comes to metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. We just simply part ways when it comes to government. So just to offer that preamble. But according to objectivists, you know, like in the ranks, the people that are under Rand, and because they've been spearheaded by these ideas, the absence of a centralized authority, the state, would lead to epistemological chaos. Epistemological chaos. You know, how are we to determine between the aggressor and initiatory violence and what's retaliatory, and people have different ideas of what justice is, and like you know, and this is a philosophy that hails the individual who has the sole responsibility for that discrete process called reasoning. There is no capital R reason hovering over in the universe. It pertains to the single, solitary, sovereign individual. That is the explicit message in objectivism, but it's being undermined and cut down by the subjectivist element, writing on Hobbes's premise, Thomas Hobbes' premises. For example, when it comes to terms such as force, coercion, rights, liberty, aggression, retaliation, defense, human beings, according to this premise, are frothing at the mouth, make it up as you go along, whim-worshipping subjectivists. They conclude that an anarchist society would collapse into a subjectivist orgy of different meanings being ascribed to concepts such as force and freedom, which would lead to an enormous bloodbath of rival gangs. However, don't we ultimately see that rampageous subjectivism being perpetrated by modern governments? Isn't that where we actually see that? And Peikoff even further states, the anarchist-capitalist primary objection is not government, but the fact that gives rise to the need for one, the need for outside, impartial observers to objectively evaluate and control the use of force in society. Why can't the people of that society do that? Why? Oh, well, you can't leave the patients of the asylum to have them to run it without the administrative staff and the doctors. Oh, so you mean the government? Yeah, I mean the government. Well, is the government made up of people? Yeah, the government is made up of people. Oh, fuck! You see, only the philosopher kings of Rand's proper government are capable of determining objectivity, while the masses are wholly dependent upon the power elite for law and order, for society. Of course, the funny thing here is that according to objectivism, I've got to stress this, reason is an attribute of the individual. That is the explicit fucking message being undercut by these premises. And in which the anarchist is making a case for Christ's sakes. It's the anarchist here is consistent in speaking up for the sovereign intellect of the fucking individual, not the objectivists. Right down to producing toothpaste, to the settlement of conflict resolutions and violence in society, such as does exist in any society. You can have government up the fucking ass. You can have the minarchist, objectivist model, wet dream government. You can still have violence. I mean, that's supposedly what necessitates the need for government is that there will be honest disagreements and violence. And that's no less true of an anarchist society, for Christ's sake. We're not coming from any kind of utopia fucking starting point. We were coming from a utopia starting point where everybody was just kumbaya, holding hands at peaceniks, holding hands and singing love songs all day, eating grapes. There would be no conception of DROs, defense resolution organizations. So, and another thing too, and I'll just wrap it up here. I've gone on a little bit lengthy here, but I'll wrap things up. Thank you for the people who've stayed with me and listening in. I hope you benefited greatly from this podcast. Now, we learn from Rand that philosophy, not politics, is primary. Philosophy, not politics, is primary. An ideal Randian government could emerge and be sustained only in a society with a significant percentage of rational people. And a substantial percentage of the population that understands and respects individual rights will have a truly limited government. See, if we have a society more geared towards that, if we had all the thinkers in the institutions who brought these ideas into consistent form as implemented in society, we would have this objectivist. First, you have to change society. Society is downstream from politics. As Rand herself said, the revolution doesn't start in the streets. Before it goes to the streets, it starts in the minds of men, right? It's all about ideas here, folks. All about ideas, right? So fine, that's great, wonderful. Let's go with that. Philosophy is primary. Politics is the result. Now, what I take issue with minarchists and objectivists who change the assumption in their attacks on anarchism, now instead of a predominantly rational culture, a stateless society resulting from a moral revolution, we have nevertheless the spectacle of bands of warring brutes, some of which are forming their own DRO agencies. Oh man, okay. I think I've gone on long enough. I will continue this line of thought in other podcasts and to talk about actually having law in a stateless society. Thank you for listening. Victor Pross, anarchist artist, pop goes to culture.